Hi, this is 2016 Macroeconomics FRQ question number 1. I've highlighted 3 parts of question number 1 that we're going to talk about real quick. As always, start with the assume. When you're reading a question, make sure that you know the starting situation the AP wants you to consider. So in this case, we know that we have a situation where the U rate is greater than the NRU, and I apologize for my terrible handwriting. We also know, if we move on to part A, that the LRPC is always vertical at the level of NRU, or the natural rate of unemployment. So that's where it lives. So if we have a situation, an economy where the U rate is greater than the NRU, we know that we're going to be at a point beyond, or past, or to the right of the LRPC. And if we go to the scoring guidelines, we find that this is the case. You'll notice that I've made a couple additions to the graph to make it a little bit more complete, and I would recommend you do the same. So LRPC, vertical at the natural rate of unemployment, which is here. And then we have point P, which is what the question asks, graphed at a point to the right of LRPC, so at U1, and an inflation rate of pi. All right. Now for part B. So this is a little bit tricky. Assuming no policy actions are taken, will the short-run Phillips curve shift to the right, shift to the left, or remain the same in the long run? And then it says, explain. So we have to go into some detail. I'd recommend going to the Phillips curve presentation, and you'll notice that the position of B in this diagram looks strangely, wrong one, looks strangely similar to positioning of P here. So both to the right of LRPC, both below the intersection of LRPC and SRPC, so the bottom right hand quadrant. So it matters less how we get from A to B for the purposes of this FRQ question, but it matters a lot what the situation is like in our economy at point B. So in our economy at point B, U rate is greater than NRU, which means that we have more people out of work than might normally or naturally be out of work. And then we also know that firms, the biggest expense for firms is often labor costs, which is one of their most significant input costs. If we have a lot of people out of work, it means that that input cost for firms is unlikely to go up anytime soon. Because if there are that many workers out of work, the firm has their choice of workers. And because workers are not scarce in this instance, there's less likely to be pressure for input costs or wages to go up. And for firms, if the input costs are unlikely to go up, they're unlikely to raise prices, which means the prices of goods and services in the economy overall is unlikely to go up as well. So there's very little inflationary pressure, very little pressure on prices to go up. So for the people in this economy, they've grown accustomed to perhaps a lower rate of inflation and no reason for inflation or price level to go up. So in a world at point B, the people have come to expect that the future, and inflation in the future, the increase in prices in the future is going to resemble or really look like the experience of the present. So at pi 1, this new lower inflation rate becomes the experience of today and the expectation for tomorrow. And if we follow this through, we notice that in the long run, we'll move back to the natural rate of unemployment or full employment output at the new lower inflation rate, pi 1. So as far as the answer and what you should include for the answer, you'll notice that, and I'm highlighting it here, B, 1 point, SRPC will shift to the left, and the reason being the economy is producing at a level below full employment with higher levels of unemployment and lower inflationary expectations because there is lower upward pressure on prices. All right, part D. So skipping part C, but in part C, if the Federal Reserve Bank wants to lower unemployment, they're going to try to increase the money supply. Expansionary open market operations, they're going to buy bonds. Buy bonds equals bigger bucks, and the reason is when the Federal Reserve buys bonds, the people who sell the bonds to the Federal Reserve now have more money. We assume that they put that money that they've received into the banking system. Now, if each of the individual banks that receives one of these deposits has more reserves, more excess reserves, the federal funds rate is the rate at which banks lend to each other. If a bank has more excess reserves, they're more willing to lend money to other banks and also lend money at lower rates because they have a lot of excess reserves to do it. So in this case, the greater reserves available to banks because of the open market operation means more excess reserves, more willingness to lend to other banks at lower rates, and a lower federal funds rate. And then part 2, because the money supply is increased, if you recall, our money market diagram looks something like that. In the case where we have increased the money supply through Federal Reserve action, and again, just a general idea, not a terribly beautiful diagram, real interest rate in the short run will decrease.